My little brother, Tony, caught me in the middle of my private act, but I have to admit that I didn't even mind. And after all, I think he didn't either. It all started on a peaceful Tuesday evening. The house was calm, quieter than usual. Mom and Dad had gone out for the night, leaving just me and my little brother, Tony. He'd always been the playful one with a knack for finding ways to annoy me in the most creative ways possible when we were kids. But now things had settled into a more mutual rhythm. We didn't get on each other's nerves as much, and the house felt peaceful. I had come home from college for fall break. It had been months since I'd last been back, and the moment I walked through the door, the flood of memories hit me. My old room was still mostly intact, though the posters on the walls were faded, and the desk was covered with things my parents had stored there over the years. It was like stepping back in time. I'd missed this feeling being home surrounded by familiar sights and sounds. Tony had changed, though. I noticed it the moment he walked into the kitchen to say hi. He wasn't the skinny, awkward kid I remembered from just a few years ago. He'd grown taller. His presence more confident. He didn't even look like the same person anymore. It was like seeing a stranger for the first time. A stranger who felt oddly familiar. What he asked, catching me staring at him. Nothing. I said quickly, shaking my head. You just look different. He grinned, scratching the back of his neck. It's called growing up, Jenny. You should try it sometime. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling. He had this way of making everything feel light, like nothing was ever too serious. But now there was something else about him. Something. I couldn't quite put my finger on that night after dinner and hours of catching up. I finally headed to my room. The day had been long traveling, unpacking and navigating the emotional overload of coming back home after so much time. All I wanted was a shower and a good night's sleep. My old bed creaked as I lay down the mattress, sagging in all the familiar places. The house was quiet, safe for the occasional sound of Tony moving around in his room down the hall. I closed my eyes, letting the comfort of being home wash over me, but sleep didn't come instead. My mind wandered. It had been a long time since I'd had any kind of intimacy. College life was busy, chaotic, and filled with more work than socializing. I hadn't had the chance to connect with anyone in months, and in lying there in the darkness, that fact weighed on me. I shifted under the covers, my body restless, my thoughts spiraling into places I hadn't meant for them to go. And then, without warning, my mind landed on Tony. I felt my breath hitch. The memory of him standing in the kitchen earlier that night flashed through my mind, the way his shirt clung to his chest, the easy confidence in his smile, the warmth of his hug. I'd brushed it off at the time. But now, in the silence of my room, those thoughts came rushing back, sharper and more vivid. What was wrong with me? This was Tony, my little brother. I shouldn't be thinking about him like this. But the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the stronger they became. My heart pounded as I remembered the way he looked at me when I teased him, his eyes glinting with mischief. I imagined his voice low and teasing, whispering my name. It wasn't just his appearance that had changed. There was a presence about him now, something that made it impossible to ignore him. I bit my lip, my body heating as my thoughts spiraled further. My hand slid under the blanket hesitantly at first, but soon I let myself sink into the moment. I closed my eyes, letting the fantasy take over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive, but it did not take long before it happened. I was completely lost in my own world. When the door to my room swung open, Tony's voice cut through the silence, and I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. He stood in the doorway, his hand still on the doorknob, his eyes wide as they took in the scene. My face burned as I realized how exposed I was, my hands still under the blanket, my breathing heavy. I scrambled, to sit up, pulling the blanket around me as if that could erase what he'd just seen. "What the hell, Tony?" I shouted, my voice louder than I intended ever heard of knocking. I didn't know. He stammered, his face turning red. He looked away, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. "I just wanted to see if you wanted to watch a movie or something. Well, clearly I'm busy." I snapped, though my voice trembled with embarrassment. "And it is 11 p. Mr. Tony, go to bed?" My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I can see that he muttered, looking towards my sheets, and his tone somewhere between amused and shocked. He glanced back at me, his eyes lingering for a moment before he quickly looked away again. I'll leave you to it." Then he turned to leave, but before he could close the door, I called out, "Wait." I wasn't sure why I said it. Maybe it was the panic, or maybe it was the tension that hung in the air between us. Whatever it was, the word escaped before I could stop it. Tony paused, his hand on the doorknob, and looked back at me. His expression was unreadable, his face still flushed. I hesitated, my mind racing for something to say, some way to salvage the situation. But the truth was, I didn't want him to leave, not yet. "I'm sorry." I didn't mean to yell. He gave a small nod, his eyes meeting mine for a moment before darting away again. "It's fine," he said, his voice softer now. "I should have knocked." We stood there in silence, the tension between us thick and heavy. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my face still burning with embarrassment. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite name. "Do you want to come in?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could think them through. Tony raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the question. "Seriously?" "Yeah," I said quickly, though my voice wavered. "I mean, you're already here." So he hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest, his expression cautious but curious. "So," he said after a moment, "what exactly were you doing in here?" I felt my face heat again, and I groaned, pulling the blanket over my head. "Oh my God, can we not talk about it?" Tony chuckled, the sound low and warm, and for some reason it made my chest tighten. "Relax, Jenny, I'm just messing with you." I peeked out from under the blanket, glaring at him. "You're such a jerk." He grinned, his teasing smirk, making my heart skip a beat. "Yeah, but you love me anyway." I didn't respond, but the truth was, he wasn't wrong. The room felt smaller with Tony in it, like the air had thickened, making it harder to breathe. He was still leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed, that teasing smirk playing on his lips. I couldn't tell if he was genuinely amused or just trying to lighten the mood, but either way it wasn't working. My heart was still pounding from the embarrassment of being caught, and I couldn't look him in the eye for more than a second without wanting to crawl under the blanket and disappear. "Relax, Jenny," Tony said, his voice softer now. "It's not like I haven't walked in on worse." "Worse?" I shot him a skeptical look, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "What's worse than seeing your sister, do you know?" He shrugged, his smirk widening. "Oh, I don't know. I once walked in on Dad trimming his nose, hair shirtless, scarring really. I couldn't help it. I laughed. It wasn't a big laugh, more like a startled chuckle, but it was enough to break some of the tension." Tony grinned clearly, pleased with himself, and for a moment things felt normal again, like we were just two siblings hanging out. No awkwardness, no unspoken tension, but the feeling didn't last. The silence that followed was heavy, and I could feel his gaze on me, watching me too. Closely, it made my skin prickle, like he could see right through me, past the embarrassment, and into the thoughts I was desperately trying to ignore. I pulled the blanket tighter around myself, as if it could shield me from whatever was happening between us. So Tony began, his tone deliberately casual. Who were you thinking about? What my head snapped up, and I stared at him, my face burning. No one, I wasn't. What kind of question is that? He shrugged again, his expression infuriatingly calm. I'm just saying you looked pretty into it. Must have been someone special. It was as if he knew Tony. I threw a pillow at him, which he caught with ease, laughing. Can you stop? Fine, fine. He held up his hands in mock surrender, still chuckling. But then his laughter faded and his expression shifted, turning more serious. I'm just messing with you, Jenny. You don't have to freak out. Jez? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Yeah, well, maybe don't barge into my room unannounced next time. Noted, he said, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched on, and I found myself staring at him, taking in the way the soft light from my bedside lamp highlighted the curve of his jaw, the way his hair fell slightly into his eyes. He'd always been a good-look kid. But now he looked different, older, more confident. It was disorienting, like I was seeing him for the first time. Why are you looking at me like that? Tony's voice broke through my thoughts, and I realized too late that I'd been staring. I started, but he raised an eyebrow, cutting me off. Yeah, you were, I groaned, pulling the blanket over my head again. Just go away, Tony. N.O.P. Not until you tell me what's going on. There's nothing going on, I shouted, my voice muffled by the blanket. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. There was something going on. Something I didn't understand. Something I couldn't even begin to put into words. And the way he was looking at me now, like he could see straight through me, wasn't helping. Tony moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. I felt the mattress dip under his weight, and my heart skipped a beat. I peeked out from under the blanket, and he was right there, his face just inches from mine. His expression was unreadable, his eyes searching mine like he was trying to figure something out. You're acting weird, he said quietly. What's wrong? Nothing, I muttered, but my voice lacked conviction. Jenny, he said, his tone soft but firm. Come on, talk to me. I hesitated, my chest tightening. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. Didn't know how to put it into words without sounding completely insane. How was I supposed to tell him that I couldn't stop thinking about him, that he'd been in my head all night? That even now, sitting so close, he was all I could think about? It's just... I trailed off, swallowing hard. It's been a weird night. Tony tilted his head, studying me. Weird how I couldn't answer, the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked away, focusing on the blanket bunched in my lap, hoping he would drop it. But he didn't. He stayed right where he was, waiting, his presence impossible to ignore. Jenny, he said again, his voice softer this time. You can tell me something, in his tone. Broke through the wall I'd been trying to put up. It wasn't teasing or judgmental. It was genuine, filled with concern, like he actually cared, and that made it even harder to keep everything bottled up. I don't know what's wrong with me. I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. It's like I'm thinking things I shouldn't be thinking. About you. I confessed. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt my stomach twist. I couldn't believe I'd actually said it out loud. I braced myself for his reaction, for him to pull away, or laugh it off, or get angry. But he didn't do any of those things. Instead, he stayed right where he was, his expression unreadable. What kind of things, he asked, his voice quiet. It was as if he wasn't surprised. I told him this. I hesitated, my throat tight. Things I shouldn't be thinking. I repeated, my eyes fixed on the blanket. I don't know why, it just happened. Tony was silent for a long moment, and I could feel my chest tightening with every second that passed. But then, to my surprise, he reached out his hand, resting lightly on my arm. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. "Jenny," he said softly, his voice steady. "It's okay." I looked up at him, my heart pounding. "It is." He nodded, his hand still on my arm. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and full of meaning. "Yeah, it's okay." Tony's voice was steady, calm, but the weight of what he just said made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure if I'd heard him right, if he really meant it, or if he was just trying to ease the awkwardness between us. But the way he looked at me, so steady, so sure, made me think he wasn't just saying it to make me feel better. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick but not uncomfortable. It was like we were both waiting for the other to make the next move, to say something that would break the tension or push things forward. "Tony." I started, my voice shaky. "I don't know what's wrong with me." He tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. "Why do you think something's wrong with you? Because this isn't normal." I said the words, tumbling out before I could stop them. "You're my little brother. You're my family. I shouldn't stop." He interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. His hand moved from my arm to my shoulder, squeezing lightly. Don't do that. Don't make it sound like you're broken or something. You're not." I blinked, caught off guard by his words. "But no," he said, cutting me off again. "Jenny, you're not some kind of freak. You're just feeling something, and that's okay." "Is it?" asked my voice, barely above a whisper. "Because it doesn't feel okay. It feels wrong, does it?" He countered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're beating yourself up over something. Something you can't control. And honestly, I don't think you should." I stared at him, my heart pounding, the way he was looking at me, the way he spoke. It was like he wasn't just trying to comfort me. There was something else there, something deeper. I didn't know what it was, but it made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. "Why aren't you freaking out about this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You should be freaking out." He gave a small shrug, his lips quirking into a faint smile. Maybe I'm just better at keeping my cool than you are, Tony." "Jenny," he said, cutting me off again. "Do you trust me?" The question took me by surprise. "Of course I trust you. Then trust me. When I say this doesn't have to be a big deal," he said softly. "It's just us. No one else has to know. No one else has to understand. It's just you and me." His words sent a shiver through me, and I felt my chest tighten. The way he said it, so calm and sure, made it sound so simple, but it wasn't simple. It was complicated and messy and terrifying. And yet, the way he was looking at me, the way his hand rested on my shoulder made it feel like maybe it didn't have to be Tony, I said, my voice barely audible. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't care if it's normal or not," he replied, his voice steady. "I care about you. And if this is something you're feeling, then maybe I feel it too." My breath caught in my throat, and I stared at him, my mind racing. Did he really mean that? Was he really saying what I thought he was saying? I didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to do. All I knew was that my heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else before I could stop myself. I reached out my hand, brushing against his. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers curled around mine, his touch warm and steady. The simple gesture sent a wave of relief and something deeper, something I didn't want to name, washing over me. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't even know what this is, me neither." He said, his voice soft. But maybe we don't have to know. Maybe we just figure it out. Together, his words made my chest ache and I felt my eyes sting. I didn't know why I was so emotional, why his words hit me so hard. But they did. I nodded slowly, squeezing his hand. Okay for a moment. Neither of us moved. We just sat there. Our hands clasped the silence between us, filled with unspoken understanding. It was like the world had faded away, leaving just the two of us, caught in this moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. And then, before I could overthink it, I leaned in. The kiss was soft, hesitant, like we were both testing the waters. His lips were warm, and I could feel the faint tremor in his hand as he held mine. It wasn't perfect. There was a clumsiness to it, a nervousness that came from the uncertainty of what we were doing, but it was real. It was us when we pulled back. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same mix of emotions I was feeling. Fear, hope, and something that felt a lot like relief. Neither of us said anything. But we didn't need to in that moment. Everything we couldn't put into words was written in the way we looked at each other. Tony gave me a small smile, his hand still holding mine. See, not so scary. I laughed softly, the sound shaky but genuine. Speak for yourself. He grinned, and for the first time all night, I felt like maybe things were going to be okay. The room felt electric after that kiss, like the air between us had changed in some irreversible way. My heart was still racing, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Tony was quiet, his gaze steady as he watched me, and for the first time in a long time, I couldn't read him. He wasn't laughing, teasing, or brushing it off. He was just there, present in a way that made my chest ache. Did that feel wrong to you? He asked softly, breaking the silence. I shook my head. My voice caught in my throat. No, I whispered. It didn't. Good, he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Because it didn't feel wrong to me either. I exhaled, shakily, the weight of his words settling over me. I'd spent so much time convincing myself that these feelings were unnatural, something to be ashamed of. But hearing him say that, hearing him validate what I was feeling, made it all seem a little less terrifying. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tony shrugged, his smile fading into something softer, more vulnerable. I don't know. No. I've never done this before, Jenny. But I think we just take it one step at a time, figure it out as we go. His words were simple, but they carried so much weight. I nodded slowly, my fingers still intertwined with his. Okay, the quiet stretched between us again, but it didn't feel heavy. This time, it felt comforting, like we were finally on the same page, finally letting go of all the unspoken tension that had been building for so long. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. Do you want to talk about it? Tony asked after a moment, his tone cautious. Talk about what? About why you've been acting so weird lately, he said, his lips quirking into a faint smile. Because let's be honest, Jenny, you've been weird. I groaned, pulling my hand away from his to cover my face. I don't know. I admitted, my voice muffled. It's just, everything about you feels different now, and it's messing with my head different. How? He asked, leaning in slightly. I hesitated, my cheeks burning. You're not the same annoying kid I grew up with. I said finally. You're confident, grown up, and I don't know how to handle that. Tony's smile widened, a hint of mischief returning to his expression. So what you're saying is, you think I'm hot? Oh my God, stop. I groaned, throwing a pillow at him. He caught it easily, laughing, and the sound made my chest tighten in a way that was both comforting and infuriating. He slowly leaned into me and kissed me again for a short moment. "I'm just saying," he teased, tossing the pillow back onto the bed. "You could have just said that, instead of making it all dramatic." "Yeah, well, I'm not exactly thrilled about it," I muttered, though my lips twitched into a reluctant smile. I felt like we were playing around with each other while also teasing. Tony's laughter faded, and his expression softened. "You don't have to be ashamed, Jenny," he said quietly. "It's just us. No one else has to know," he said while joining my sheets. The way he said it so calm and sure made my chest ache. I knotted my throat tight. "Yes," I said softly. "Just us." But while I said it, he now lay next to me, and he had seen everything. Without saying a word, he moved his fingers towards the spot and continued. With where I was left at, it was amazing. I had never felt something like this before. While he was busy, I lost control and asked him to go even further. And so he did. I'm not going to jump into details, but let's just say it was one of the craziest nights of my life when he was done and we both lay down. I could feel that we both realized what had just happened in some way. It felt wrong, but in the other way, it felt like the best thing I have ever felt. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Something had shifted between us. The tension was still there, but it wasn't as heavy. It was like we'd taken the first step into something new, something uncertain, and now we were just trying to figure out how to navigate it. Tony stayed in my room for a while, sitting on the edge of the bed as we talked about everything and nothing. It felt like old times back when we were kids and used to stay up late, whispering secrets to each other in the dark. But now there was an undercurrent of something else, something deeper. Something neither of us fully understood. When he finally left to go to his own room, I felt both relieved and strangely empty. I lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of him, the way he'd kissed me, the way his hand had felt in mine, the way he'd looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. It was all so overwhelming, but it was also impossible to ignore. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. For a moment, I thought it was our parents, but then I remembered they were out for the weekend. It was just me and Tony. I got out of bed and headed downstairs, my heart racing at the thought of seeing him again. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Awkwardness maybe, or tension. But when I walked into the kitchen and saw him sitting at the table with a bowl of cereal, he looked completely normal too. "Normal morning," he said, flashing me a grin. "Sleep?" "Well, yeah," I said, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee. "You like a baby," he said, his tone light. But when I sat down across from him, I caught the way his eyes lingered on me, just a little too long, the way his smile softened slightly. It made my chest tighten all over again. We ate breakfast, in relative silence, the occasional clink of spoons against bowls filling the air. I could feel him watching me, though, and it made it hard to focus on anything else. My mind kept replaying the events of the night before the kiss, the way he'd said, "Just us, Jenny," he said, suddenly breaking the silence. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat at the seriousness in his tone. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, though. My voice wavered. "Why wouldn't I be?" He tilted his head, studying me, "Because last night was a lot, and I just want to make sure you're not freaking out." "I'm fine," I said, though. My cheeks burned really. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. If you say so, the rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the tension between us remained, simmering just below the surface. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands felt charged, like we were both waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what, but I knew it was coming. And when it finally did, I wasn't ready. The air between us had grown heavier as the day wore on, every small interaction charged with unspoken tension. I could feel it every time Tony looked at me, Every time he spoke, even when we were sitting silently in the same room, it was like a storm building on the horizon. And I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke. That evening, the house was quiet again. Our parents had called to say they'd be staying at Grandma's another night, which left just me and Tony alone. He'd gone up to his room after dinner, leaving me to sit on the couch with the TV playing quietly in the background. I tried to focus on the screen, but my mind kept drifting, replaying the events of the night before, the way he kissed me, the way he'd looked at me afterward like I wasn't just his sister, but something more. It was terrifying and exhilarating. I was so lost in thought that I didn't hear him come back downstairs. When he sat down beside me, I jumped, slightly startled by his sudden presence. "Sorry," he said, his lips quirking into a small smile. "Didn't mean to scare you." "It's fine," I said quickly, though. My heart was still racing for a while. We just sat there, the TV casting a faint glow across the room. Tony didn't say anything, and neither did I, but the tension between us was palpable. I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye, and it made my skin prickle. "Jenny," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "Can we talk?" I turned to look at him, my chest tightening at the seriousness in his tone. What about us?" he said, his gaze steady about last night. My stomach flipped. I wasn't sure I was ready for this conversation, but I nodded anyway. "Okay?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking about it all day," he admitted, about what happened, about what it means, and I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, and I think he trailed off, his cheeks flushing slightly. "I think I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." His words sent a jolt through me, and I stared at him, my heart pounding. "You don't." He shook his head, his eyes meeting mine. "I don't. Because it didn't feel wrong, Jenny. It felt right the way he said it, so sure, so certain, made my chest ache." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to put everything I was feeling into words. All I knew was that he was looking at me like I was the only thing that mattered, and it made me want to cry. "I'm scared, Tony," I admitted, finally, my voice trembling. "This is all so new, and I don't know what to do." "You don't have to know," he said softly. "We'll figure it out together." He reached out his hand, brushing against mine, and I felt a shiver run through me at the simple touch. I looked down at our hands, then back up at him, my throat tight. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I've never been more sure about anything," he said, his voice steady. "I care about you, Jenny, more than I probably should, but I'm done trying to ignore it." His words hit me like a wave, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, but it quickly deepened as all the emotions I'd been holding back came rushing to the surface. His hands moved to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I felt my heart swell with something I couldn't name when we finally pulled back. I rested my forehead against his, my breath coming in short, shaky bursts. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We keep this just between us," he said softly. "We take it slow, and we figure it out." I nodded, my chest tight. Okay, for the first time in what felt like forever. I didn't feel scared. I didn't feel ashamed. All I felt was him, his warmth, his presence, his unwavering support. And it was enough that night. As we lay side by side on the couch, the TV still playing softly in the background, I realized something. What we had might not have been normal. It might not have been something anyone else could understand. But it was our hours, and that was enough for now. It was enough. I know my story might sound weird for some people, but I am happy I can share it in some way. I feel bad about what I did. Should I please? Let me know what you think of it in the comments.